This is the story of three Polish friends who quit their jobs to create a horror video game, even though the genre terrifies them. They had no experience in game development and no backup plan if things didn't work out. Yet, after 4 years of non-stop work and multiple nervous breakdowns, they crafted one of the most unsettling and terrifying games ever made. Darkwood. But how exactly did they pull it off? And why did they decide to take an indefinite break from making games after releasing Darkwood? Let's find out. Artur Kordas, Gustav Stagaczewski, and Jakub Kuch first met in college and quickly became friends. They all shared a curious trait: none of them enjoyed anything related to horror. The feeling of fear was simply not something they enjoyed. Years later, after graduating and finding jobs in the animation and graphic design industry, they reconnected to discuss making a video game in their spare time. Around the end of 2012, with no prior experience in game development, they began work on a small tower defense game inspired by the Amiga title Home Alone. The concept was straightforward. Players would protect the home base at night from monsters and rebuild it during the day. Artur, Gustav, and Jakub believed they could finish it in about a month. Meanwhile, hoping to gain more experience, they attended a global game jam in January 2013. The theme was Heartbeat, and in just 48 hours, the three developers made a game about Kevin Costner eating bull hearts, inspired by Dances with Wolves. Their entry won the game jam and caught the attention of media outlets like Kotaku. Seizing the opportunity, they established a name for their studio, Azert Wizard Studio, and settled on a title for their tower defense project, Darkwood. This way, any coverage of their game jam entry would also mention Darkwood. After a successful game jam, the team returned to their main project with renewed confidence and motivation. That being said, they were aware of their limitations as a small team, so they went with a top-down perspective because it was quicker and easier to implement. As they experimented with mechanics such as a limited field of view, dynamic lighting, and intense sound design, they saw the potential for a horror game that, despite their own fears, was exactly the type of horror experience they had always wanted to play. One that avoids cheap jump scares in favor of building a tense, unnerving atmosphere. Early ideas of a semi-open world, crafting and skill systems, stealth and combat, and branching storylines that could influence the game world soon took shape. In response, the three friends decided to transform their initial tower defense concept into a fully fledged roguelike survival horror experience. Despite their fear of the genre, they were always fascinated by the core themes and elements it offered. The blurry line between reality and nightmares, unsettling visions, hidden and inexpressible evil, alienation, and loneliness. These ideas fueled their imaginations and led to a game concept focused on exploring a terrifying forest, without relying on jump scares. When they began work on Darkwood, the dominant trend in horror films and games was to use jump scares to evoke fear. While the team agrees these can be effective and entertaining, they also find them shallow when overused. To them, a horror experience that engages the imagination and leaves room for the mind to fill in the blanks is far more compelling. If you, just like Artur, Gustav, and Jakub, want to make games or develop other types of digital experiences, I highly recommend checking out Boot.dev, which is this video's sponsor. Boot.dev is an online platform that has turned learning how to code into a fun and captivating RPG experience. They provide courses for the programming languages Python, Go, SQL, and others so that you can learn backend development from start to finish. The platform is designed to make sure you'll be writing a ton of code, as the people at Boot.dev believe the best way to learn to program is by getting your hands on the keyboard and completing projects. All the while, you'll be earning XP, levels, and achievements by completing quests. Not everyone has the means to pay for a membership, so all of their content is free to read and watch in guest mode. A paid membership unlocks the game and all the interactive components that go with it, the whole reason why Boot.dev is so engaging and efficient at teaching you how to code. Furthermore, the Boot.dev Discord community is very active and there to help if you ever get stuck on your coding challenges. Go to boot.dev and try out the courses for free. Then use my code ThatGuyGlen to get 25% off your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. Boot.dev, learn backend development the smart way. Now back to the video. The three developers were eager to add their own individual ideas and influences, which helped shape the grand vision for Darkwood. In an interview, Gustav mentioned that the game's tone and atmosphere drew heavily from the works of Andrei Tarkovsky, Stanley Kubrick, and David Lynch, especially Twin Peaks and The Shining. Meanwhile, the game's story was inspired by authors such as Stanisław Lem and the Strugawski brothers. Making great work is often the result of dealing with your own self, your fears, dreams, or events in your life that had a profound effect on you. Many great horror authors have lived troubled lives or experienced traumatic events. Stephen King witnessed the tragic death of his childhood friend. Stanisław Lem saw many atrocities done by other human beings during and after World War II. Their work is often the result of trying to cope with those experiences. So dig deep into the darkest corners of your mind and confront your demons. Forge them into a story or experience that only you can tell. When it came to gameplay, the team was inspired by Dark Souls. Arthur had always been fascinated by how From Software combined game mechanics with straightforward audiovisual elements to create an atmosphere of desolation, sadness, mystery, and ever-lurking danger. He also admires how Souls games avoid spoon-feeding information to players, instead encouraging them to learn through discovery. Meanwhile, the grim atmosphere and dark humor of the first two Fallout games, along with meaningful choices that have lasting consequences, influenced the team's approach to storytelling in Darkwood. The Polish team also drew inspiration from real-life experiences. Both Gustav and Arthur suffer from hallucinations when they wake up during the night, causing them to see bizarre, almost surreal things. According to Gustav, it was pretty easy to channel these experiences into the emotions they wanted the player to feel. Once all three developers had shared their ideas and influences, they set out to combine them into a cohesive vision. However, their lack of experience meant they vastly underestimated the difficulty of weaving these various elements together, something that would eventually lead to many sleepless nights. The fear of the unknown and using the player's imagination against them were core design principles. As a result, the developers invested significant effort in creating a procedurally generated forest, ensuring each playthrough felt unfamiliar and kept players on edge. Major locations were still handcrafted, but to further emphasize the fear of the unknown, some areas would change drastically based on the player's decisions throughout the branching storylines. Speaking of locations, the team decided to set Darkwood in Poland, where they were born and raised. This choice felt natural as it allowed them to craft a more genuine and convincing narrative. It also served as a way to introduce players to Polish folklore, which they hoped would feel both exotic and refreshing to most players. The protagonist had to match the game's unsettling and mysterious atmosphere, so a typical hero was off the table. Even in the earliest stages of development, the team envisioned a voiceless, strange outsider with distorted, repulsive features. An anti-hero who would provoke resentment among the forest inhabitants while instilling alienation and dread in the player. When developing the game's overall look and feel, the team chose to keep the pixelated art style from their tower defense prototype, along with the top-down perspective to simplify asset production and animations. Although they considered the graphics and distant camera to be the game's weakest points, they leveraged these limitations to their advantage. Because the pixelated graphics make it harder to identify characters, enemies, and objects, players have to rely more on their imagination, allowing the developers to play tricks on the player's imagination. The game was built in Unity, and all the code was written in C#. In March 2013, after fleshing out core combat and survival mechanics, the Polish developers created a vertical slice of Darkwood and posted a gameplay trailer on their YouTube channel. The trailer caught the attention of the press and received far more positive reactions than they ever anticipated. Realizing they might be able to make a living from game development, they spent the next 2 months preparing an Indiegogo campaign to help fund Darkwood. To introduce the game to the world, they even produced a silly video explaining why they needed financial support. The campaign launched in May 2013, but the crowdfunding initially struggled, and it seemed the team was not going to reach their funding goal. However, in the final week, they released a second gameplay trailer that gave them the boost they needed. Ultimately, they raised over 54,000 euros, and this motivated the three friends to go all in. Without a backup plan, they quit their jobs to focus all their time on Darkwood. They estimated it would take about a full year to finish development. Over the course of the following year, it became clear that the project was full of contradictions, along with other major problems. We did not have any experience or knowledge in the field of design or production, so it took us a lot of time and effort to put the conflicting elements of the puzzle together. With time, also the differences in our visions started to emerge, and we were unable to resolve them all completely. This was coupled with the poor organization of our work. Every decision, even the smallest ones, were made together, which considerably delayed the production of the game and often led to misunderstandings and frustrations. Essentially, it came down to two visions for Darkwood. One emphasized permadeath, high replayability, a significant role for procedurally generated worlds, and a large number of mini-stories. The other focused on handcrafted locations, scripted events, and a branching narrative as the main incentive for exploration. Over time, it became clear that these two approaches were incompatible. After a lot of discussions, the developers started to lean more towards the second vision. This meant removing permadeath entirely. A difficult decision given they had promised Indiegogo backers that it would be a core feature. Because the procedural generation aspect had been built around permadeath, the team had to redirect much of the game's design. As development progressed, they gradually scaled back their use of procedural generation, a shift that posed significant technical challenges. Although buildings and other landmarks remain randomly placed on the map for each playthrough, the original plan for a fully procedurally generated forest is no longer present. Meanwhile, in other areas, the game's scope continued to grow until it was far too ambitious to complete within a single year. Knowing they had something special on their hands, the developers refused to compromise just to meet their initial deadline. This inevitably meant delaying the release, but there was one major problem. The studio was running out of money. Their Indiegogo campaign had been funded based on a one-year development timeline. After considering their options, the developers chose to release an early access version of Darkwood on Steam. They hoped this would not only secure additional funding, but also provide valuable community feedback. Darkwood's early access release was positively received by players and sold far more copies than anticipated. Encouraged by this, the three friends decided to expand the game's scope even further, including the addition of new NPCs to interact with. In the early stages of development, all three contributed to character design, but Arthur soon became mainly responsible for this task. The Wolfman was the first character for which Arthur created concept art. Initially, he was a one-dimensional, over-the-top figure that combined the worst traits of both animals and humans. As development progressed and new characters and story elements were added, the Wolfman became more nuanced and mysterious. However, the team kept him as the game's most obvious antagonistic NPC, providing a stark contrast to the other characters in Darkwood. During the early access phase, the developers frequently tested new mechanics to gauge their impact on the overall experience and see how the community would react. Jakub recalls one instance when they introduced the first iteration of shadow creatures, which received such a negative response that they removed them almost immediately. After completely redesigning the creatures, they reintroduced them, this time without significant problems or backlash. By then, the three developers had begun to mostly overcome their fear of horror games and scary movies, which provided fresh inspiration for the remainder of Darkwood's development. Composing the game's soundtrack and creating sound effects proved challenging, primarily because neither Arthur, Gustav nor Jakub had much, if any, experience with sound design or music composition. My specialization is art, but as I was the only person in the team that had any idea about making sound, although still very vague, sound design and music fell on my shoulders. Making Darkwood's OST was a never-ending improvisation. I was playing with a medium that I did not fully understand. Maybe thanks to that, we were able to create something unique and hard to define, something that breaks the common principles, which I did not know about during production. Arthur used a largely minimalist approach to audio, leaving long stretches of silence to build tension and dread. This, along with other techniques, allowed the horror to play out partly in the player's mind, effectively toying with their imagination. After multiple nervous breakdowns, nightmares, and non-stop crunch the last 2 years, Darkwood was starting to look like a cohesive video game. However, the team's democratic approach of discussing every issue together led them to miss every deadline they set. Over time, negative Steam reviews began appearing from players frustrated by the slow development. Some even suspected the studio had abandoned the game. Finally, in August 2017, after 4 years of blood, sweat, and tears, Darkwood version 1.0 was released on Steam. Both gamers and critics were impressed with the final result, especially by how each element contributed to a cohesive and terrifying horror experience. The slow-building tension, minimalist soundtrack, strategic use of silence, and fragmented story, requiring players to piece it together themselves, were all universally praised. The team, however, had little time to celebrate, as they were very busy with fixing bugs and other technical issues. In fact, Gustav spent the evening of his 30th birthday having a meltdown while trying to fix a save file high-profile problem that many players were experiencing. Meanwhile, they were getting flooded by emails. Most of them were scams from people claiming to be YouTubers or bloggers, hoping to score a free Steam key. Initially, the studio handed out keys without hesitation, wanting Darkwood to gain as much attention as possible. Unfortunately, many of these keys were then sold on controversial storefronts like G2A. When the developers discovered this, they were furious. It became impossible for them to do giveaways or provide keys to those who genuinely couldn't afford the game. Moreover, seeing people refund the game on Steam made them realize they should offer the game for free. Steam lets you refund the game if you haven't played it for more than 2 hours, and as a developer, we can see the reason why people refunded it. When we read the explanation from someone who wrote that he needed the refund because he didn't want his parents to be stressed out when seeing the bill at the end of the month, well, it made us feel quite bad. Acid Wizard Studio chose to make Darkwood available for free through a save torrent on the Pirate Bay, an unusual move for a small studio that had just released its first game. Though they needed the income to continue developing games, it was more important to Arthur, Gustav and Jakub that people who genuinely couldn't afford the game still had access to it. Additionally, they hoped to draw attention to the problematic practices of Steam key reseller sites. The reaction to their decision was overwhelmingly positive, earning support from both the press and players worldwide. Many people even bought the game simply to show their support for the studio's decision. Once the dust had settled, the developers took a well-deserved break. Although creating and releasing Darkwood was immensely satisfying, it was also the hardest thing any of them had ever done, leaving them emotionally exhausted. They were so drained, in fact, that they waited 5 years before publicly revealing what they'd been doing during that time. In a 2023 post on Imgur, the team shared that Darkwood had sold 1.5 million copies. They also noted it's debatable whether that figure would be higher or lower if they hadn't posted the game on the Pirate Bay. Regardless, the sales numbers surpassed our wildest expectations. The post then explained that developing Darkwood took such a physical and mental toll on the team that they took an extended break throughout 2018. By 2019, they felt ready to re-enter the world of game development. The team spent many days establishing core rules for handling future projects, and they hired 3 additional developers to help lighten the workload. It seemed fitting to begin this new chapter by creating an update for Darkwood that addressed technical issues and bugs they hadn't previously been able to fix. Unfortunately, the extensive backend work required for this update made it far more complicated than anticipated. Due to limited manpower and a desire to finally release a new game, the team decided to place the update on the back burner until after they launched another project. They briefly considered returning to the world of Darkwood with a sequel, spin-off, prequel, or even DLC, but the memory of the immense effort poured into Darkwood was still too fresh. Ultimately, creating a new IP felt more exciting. After brainstorming various ideas, they settled on a concept they codenamed The Prisoner. It tells the story of a political prisoner trapped in a factory-turned-prison, set in a fictional Eastern European setting during the 1980s. The entire experience is presented in first person, immersing the player in the harsh reality of prison life. The unique hook is that the protagonist has a highly valued talent, the ability to design and apply tattoos. According to the studio, a complex language of symbols was planned, meaning that figuring out exactly what to draw, based on each client's allegiance, crimes, and requests, would be integral to the gameplay. All of this was combined with survival mechanics, exploration, and plenty of NPCs to meet. However, as they continued prototyping gameplay ideas, it became clear that the theme of prison life wasn't a good fit for most of the team. They decided to move on and explore 2 new concepts, codenamed 101 and Soccer Kids. The first was an experimental, unsettling fourth wall-breaking idea set in the 1980s, involving multiple intertwined games and featuring unusual asynchronous online gameplay, an homage to those old NES cartridges packed with hundreds of games. Soccer Kids, on the other hand, began as a physical gameplay experiment using a magnetic board and various items found around the office. From this setup, an idea emerged: children playing soccer through the eyes of a mathematical prodigy who analyzes every angle and distance in detail. The setting was close to the developers' hearts, Poland in the 90s, but instead of a creepy forest, they crafted a vivid, playful, over-the-top world seen through the lens of kids who had watched too many cartoons. Soccer Kids turned out to be the perfect fit for their next project, so the team worked on it until they had a fully playable build. In June 2023, they released it for free on Steam, encouraging players to share their feedback with the goal of making an improvement improved commercial version. Less than 2 months later, Acid Wizard Studio announced they're taking a break for the foreseeable future and explained their reasoning on Twitter. We haven't been able to create a work environment that would not be destructive to our personal lives. Our families are our top priority and they should not be affected negatively by our work. So ultimately, we decided that it would be best if we part ways, with a possibility of returning in 5 to 10 years when we get our shit together. As a final farewell, Darkwood received one last major update addressing numerous bugs and introducing various quality of life improvements. The studio emphasized they weren't disappearing entirely and hoped their games would continue to live on. They mentioned the possibility of others creating a Darkwood sequel or continuing development on soccer kits. While it may be a long time before we see Acid Wizard Studio or any of their IPs return to the gaming world, the fact that 3 inexperienced friends from Poland left such a lasting impact on the horror genre is a remarkable achievement that won't be forgotten anytime soon.